2:01, so we're going to jump into this. I want to welcome you all to our virtual Sorkin Summit. My name is Jeff Franco, and I am the director of the Sorkin Center, which is part of Compass. We are thrilled to have nonprofit leaders and board members from Chicago, DC, and Philadelphia, and have a wonderful panel that will be participating today on our Sorkin Summit. Just a couple things I wanted to make you aware of. Folks on the line that I hear from Compass. Suzanne Laporte is our CEO. She's on this. Beth Dolly is our executive director of our Philadelphia site for Compass. Natalie Tesler is our executive director for our Compass site in Chicago. Nalini Rogers is our director of our onboard program. Wendy Gultieri is my partner in crime at the Sorkin Center. And then we have a number of Compass board members as well. So for those of you that have attended our Sorkin Summit, it is our signature event that is live every year. For obvious reasons, it's become virtual. We've postponed our Sorkin Summit, the live version, for October 29th. But because we've gotten such positive feedback from having these sessions, we decided to have a virtual Sorkin Summit. So we've broken this up into two different summits. One of them was last week on governance. The one we're having today is on fundraising. And so the summit really looks to cover the basic components of both nonprofit management from an executive director and a board member standpoint. We obviously, for this one, are doing it a little bit different in terms of having a lens on COVID and how that impacts what's going on with fundraising currently. You are joined by about 75 different nonprofits in this group. I'm going to ask you, we really try to make this as interactive as possible. It's clear that it's not as easy to do in a virtual context. Certainly when we have nearly 130 nonprofit leaders on this, but there are a couple ways we will do it. One of them is the chat function. I'm sure most of you should be familiar with Zoom at this point. During my presentation, certainly during the panel discussion, feel free to send the chat to everyone, any comments you may have of how that relates to your nonprofit. You can also send personal messages to me or to other individuals in the room. We also want you to be able to connect. A really big part of what Sorkin does is try to connect nonprofit leaders. And so we will be setting a list when this is over of the individuals and the nonprofits and city they represent. If you don't want to be on that list, if you can just send us an email and let us know. We're not going to share the email addresses, but we just thought there would be an interest in knowing who is in the room. Currently, what I'm going to ask you to do in the chat screen, if you could just go ahead and type in your name, your position, as well as your organization and city you represent, so that the group can kind of, again, have some bearing on who is actually in the room with us. We also will be doing polls, a few polls during it. They're on different topics. These are anonymous polls. It's really, again, for you to be able to see how certain nonprofit leaders are dealing with particular topics. So we'll be putting those up as well, and I'll be in real time posting the results from those polls as well. So just a little background on me. I have been the director of the Sorkin Center for about the last year and a half. Prior to Sorkin, I was the executive director of City Year in Washington, D.C., and vice president with the national organization. I was also interim executive director for our City Year site in Miami. In addition to Sorkin Center, I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland, as well as American University. I teach a graduate course in nonprofit management, and I'm also the CEO of Community Consulting Group, which is a strategic consulting group for nonprofit enterprise. Okay, so I see people are putting their names and alliances in. We really appreciate that. I'm going to start by just quickly doing one of the polls you'll see. One is asking, in this context, are you a board member? Are you an executive director, CEO? Are you a staff or you don't currently serve on the board? And the second question is what your budget is for your nonprofit. So I'm just gonna go ahead and launch that, but I'm also just gonna start going into the presentation as set. The way we're gonna do this is I'm gonna give a quick slide deck presentation, and then I wanna get to really, I think the most exciting part of this which is hearing from some other nonprofit leaders and their board chairs and board members to hear how they're dealing with fundraising during COVID-19. And so again, we'll try to have that be as interactive as possible. I am going to leave the poll open for just a couple more minutes so we can get everyone else to get involved in it. And that will be about it. And then we will try to be a good steward of your time this afternoon. So we'll try to finish on time, if not before. We have done in the past breakout rooms. I think we're probably too big of a group to do that. And usually the conversation with the panel is a pretty rich one. So I don't think we'll necessarily need to have a breakout room. But certainly we want to encourage you to either reach out directly to me or somebody from Sorkin, or directly to your colleagues that are on the call. If you want to be connected to somebody, we're happy to do so. So I'm going to share the results for this, and not all of you may have been able to answer it, but I have found that when I share my screen, I lose access to being able to manage the polls. So I will do another poll when we finish the slide deck itself. So I am going to share my screen now, and we will get rolling. Okay. So I am going to give you some background today. This is the things that we're going to discuss. One of them, and these really are tied together, is what's the executive director's role as it pertains to fundraising. Also, what the board member's role in it and fundraising as well. Again, with the lens on COVID. We'll look specifically, of course, at COVID and how it's fundraising as we know it. And then we'll get into the panel discussion that we'll have with our guests that I'll be introducing after I finish this slide deck. I say this in every session that we've had, and we've done probably about 5 or 6 at this point, but I just think it's important to impress upon us all that there are no experts in the room as it pertains to fundraising during COVID-19, nor in any aspect of a nonprofit management. We all started at the same ground zero, and we're all trying to learn as we go along here. And so I say that because the thoughts, ideas, suggestions I'm putting forward may or may not have relevance to you. Our hope is that at least 1 or 2 of the things that you hear today will, and that could be something you could implement at your organizations. But I certainly don't want us to think that, you know, this is the expert saying this is what needs to happen with fundraising during COVID-19. So one of the interesting things about all of this is that, you know, there are some things that, as far as fundraising is concerned, do not change, whether pre, during, or post-COVID. And this is just a real look at what we already know, really, which is why the reason donors get involved in an organization in the first place. And this may not change. This is actually something that probably remain part of the foundation as to why a funder gets involved in your organization. They care deeply about the mission. That's not going anywhere. They believe that the organization is doing a great job with things that they're going about and working in that community. Oftentimes, it is a response to the relationship world of somebody else. So this is obviously a strong role that board members play, which is reaching out to someone in their relationship world to get involved in the organization. Some other reasons is to invest in an enterprise that benefits the community. Certainly with some donors, there's some ego involved in terms of wanting to be honored. You have galas that are honoring people. You have buildings that have the names and plaques on the buildings for what they do. And last but not least, to leave a legacy. A lot of these stakeholders and philanthropists are hoping they're investing in something that will be there long after that gift is given. And the other caveat that I want to make, kind of emphasize here, is that we constantly hear about the frontline nonprofits that are just providing such critical work during this crisis that we're in. You hear a lot about the homeless shelters and the food pantries, and their mission is certainly critical, but I don't want any organization to feel their mission isn't critical as well, right? There's a reason why your nonprofit was started, because there was a gap somewhere in the community that the nonprofit was looking to step into and fill. And so you should really lead with that about the importance and the urgency and whatever pain you may be going through in keeping things moving in the right direction for your nonprofit. And I just think it's important to press upon that, regardless of what sector your nonprofit represents. Okay, so looking at the executive director. So again, this is really, I'm not going to go into a lot of the basics of fundraising. One, because you already know it all. But two, because we're in a very special and unique time, I think, in our nonprofits and how we're running them and how we're keeping them moving in the right direction. What I would say is this, and again, I do think a lot of these bullet points really have relevance regardless of us being in a pandemic or not, but I think they just seem to be emphasized now in the situation that we're currently in. And one of the things, you have so much on your plate, from the fundraising to the governance, the managing, to the staff. Many have had to make difficult decisions and letting go of staff. When it comes to the development and fundraising aspect of what you do, your bandwidth is limited. And if you were to choose what you would focus on, I would really look at leaning heavily into the stewardship piece of fundraising. So we all know that to bring a donor on for the first time involves a lot of work to make that happen. And once they're there, the stewarding of that gift and renewing of that gift is usually easier than bringing them on in the first place, if your stewardship is solid. And so that should be an area that you really should lean into. And then a little lighter into the asks. Now, it depends on the type of ask you're talking about. So I think that in this period of time we're in, the first asks are really difficult ones to do in this period of time. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. One advice that I got from a nonprofit leader was that he asked permission from his donors if he's going to make an ask. So basically reaching out to a donor and saying, there's an ask I'd like to make of you, but I want to ask permission for me to do so before I go about doing it, because we don't know exactly what may be going on the other side of that ask in terms of their own personal or professional situations. But a strategy would be to segment your current donors. Really, you can base it upon when the gift started and when the renewal date is, what is the size of the gift, or the relationship with the donor that you're working with. And then looking at providing one-on-one updates to those donors. Now, ideally, it would be great if you could give one-on-one updates to all of your donors, but that may not be feasible. We have all seen in our email inboxes, mass emails are coming from nonprofits talking about the situation that they're in and hoping organizations support. That's a check the box needed thing to do, and there is value in it, but it doesn't compare to having the one-on-one updates. And so something to consider about how you personalize how you are currently reaching out to your donor base in a way that is emphasized and maybe unique to the way it was in the past. Another best practice in this is sometimes the best ask is no ask at all. I remember, it still remains in my mind, about 7 years ago, I had it was a gentleman that was a senior vice president at a commercial real estate firm, and he asked to have coffee with me. I assumed that he wanted to meet with me because he wanted to see if we would move our lease from where we were at to moving it with him. And oftentimes, the executive director, you're always in the position of asking and asking. In this case, I thought I was going to be asked. And by the end of the conversation, all I learned from him was he wanted to know more about me. He wanted to hear about my background, where I grew up, how I liked working for City Year, and walked away and said, let's keep in touch. And that made such an impression upon me. And if there's a time to do something like that, which is just an empathetic kind of piece of humanity to practice, this is the time to do it. And it really carries into something else when I talk about Ubuntu. For those that don't know, it's an African proverb which says, I am a person through other people. My humanity is tied to yours. Again, this is a nice way to live your life, no matter what situation you happen to be in, but it really has applicability now. So one thought is to consider informal approaches to reaching out to your donor base. So certainly emails, I'm sure as executive directors, you can certainly relate to crafting these emails to a particular donor, making sure it is, worded correctly and the ask is in the right place or the right email. Again, something that shouldn't be omitted, but sometimes an impromptu call or a text is something that will make much more of an impact. Also, reaching out to your donors without an agenda. Again, this goes back to sometimes the best ask is not making an ask at all. Um, and the third one would be supporting the donors in different ways, really taking the nonprofit off the table. I'm sure some of your donors are senior citizens. This has been a particularly stressful time for them. Something like delivering groceries to them. I've had two donors that I've had for over 10 years at City Year, and I just decided one Saturday to go to each of their houses to deliver them flowers and talk to them at a distance. Now, as an executive director, if I was doing something like that, I'm willing to bet that when things cool down and I ask to meet with them about something more relevant to the organization, they're probably going to be more apt to say yes than if they didn't. And then finally, that COVID-19 has affected everyone in different ways. I love the phrase that be gentle with the people you come across today. You have no idea what that person is going through. And I think that is really, again, relevant here. Having that lens on when you're reaching out to a donor about we don't know what's going on with them financially, if they're homeschooling their children, if they're having job insecurity, if their stock portfolio is tanked. I mean, there's just so many personal things they're going through, and always having that lens on when we're reaching out to our donor community. And then the board engagement strategies. I mean, as you know, both as board members and executive directors, the work that we do is certainly intertwined with both groups and is such an incredibly critical piece of the success of the organization, both from a governance standpoint as well from a fundraising standpoint. And again, there are certain practices and bylaws that don't necessarily change, but again, in the unique environment where we are in, there are some approaches that could be considered here. So one of them is looking at the board as an extension of your staff, which again, to some extent you're doing anyway. But what's interesting, if you think about it, is that your staff members and your board members are in a logistical situation that aren't different from one another. Usually your staff went to their building and worked, and your board members were going to their offices to work. Now everyone's at home. So we're asking board members to have all hands on deck, which is a huge ask because we're asking them to do so much as it is. But I think it's important that they hear that from their executive directors, that piece of urgency that executive director cannot do it himself or herself. I'm curious to talk to our panel about their check-ins with their board chairs. Generally speaking, regular and more frequent check-ins would make sense now. So whereas you may have had your quarterly board meetings, I've talked to executive directors that have a daily or a weekly check-in with their board chair and with board members in this extraordinary time that we're in. Another one is looking for peer-to-peer opportunities. So by that, I mean looking at your 10 board members, for example, and trying to find, rather than sending a mass email out to your board, looking for 2 board members that might be able to partner on something they're working on. You know, this is a kind of a great way to create a little bit of positive pressure on your board because it is very direct reach out to the 2 of them. I mentioned before about the personal medium that you use. I've always said that with my board and with any board as an executive director, at minimum, foundationally, you want to create a professional working relationship with that board member and the other board members on the board. However, what I have found is that the magic really happens when you can create a personal relationship with that board member. So the example I always think of is I had a board member on my board at City Year that worked for Comcast. And in the beginning of the relationship, I would send very formal emails to her when I made asks for things that I wanted to have happen. Over time, we've developed a personal rapport with one another. She liked me as a person, not just as an executive director. And then we started actually being able to interact with things like phone calls or texts. And it was a game changer for me to send that formal email to her as opposed to sending a text and saying, hey, can you make X, Y, Z happen for me? I'm really kind of in a bind here. So again, it's an opportunity to continue deepening those relationships that you have with your individual board members. and then customizing your approach for each board member. One exercise that I've done in a number of board trainings that I found to be very effective is to take the Super Friends motif and to ask the question, what is the superpower of each and every one of the board members on my board? There's a reason as executive director that I ask that person to join. But sometimes, just from the lack of transparency, the board member may not realize exactly what that reason is. And so this is a great exercise to conduct with your board as executive directors, which is have each board member write down, if they had to write down what was the one superpower they had as it relates to sitting on that board, what do they think it is? And then have the executive director do the exact same thing. And then to share with the group what that board member thinks his superpower is and what the executive director thought the superpower was. Neither one is wrong, but it creates a new kind of understanding between the two, right? Just to stick with the Comcast example, if the Comcast board member is saying, well, I think my superpower is that I have a great finance background or accounting background to help with the board. But my approach to it is, well, you work for Comcast, you represent a big company, you have access to funding, you have access to a whole big relationship world. That is a great way to kind of create a better understanding between the ED and the board member. So I have found a lot of effectiveness in running through that exercise. And last but not least, and this is another example of one of those things that should exist pre, during, and post COVID-19, is gratitude. I don't think I've ever had a board meeting where I didn't start and end the meeting by thanking that board, by recognizing that I knew they had day jobs, that they were doing this job with us on the board in a volunteer capacity, giving of their time and treasure and expertise to help us move the organization forward. I wanted them always to know, because after I was going to follow with a bunch of asks for them anyway, that I really felt gratitude for them for what they were doing. And so I think now, as we're asking our board members to do even more than what they've initially been asked to do, never forgetting to showing that gratitude for them for doing it. And then getting into the board. And again, I think the board and the ED are intertwined. And I think one of the interesting things about the stat you see here, some of this is fairly intuitive of why do board members typically fundraise. But the one I have in red is the one that really, I think, stands out for me. Obviously, having a contact list is important. To allow the use of name, what that says to me is, and I've always said this to my board, some board members don't like asking for money, right? People always say to me, you must love asking for money. And I'm like, actually, I don't particularly like asking for money. I do like to fundraise. Asking for money is episodic. Fundraising is long-term. And to me, fundraising is code for relationship building. So that gentleman from that real estate firm, he was from a private company, so it wasn't technically fundraising, but he was fundraising. If he were come back to me later and asked me to consider working with him, I would probably consider it. The one thing I ask from my board members is, if I had to only ask one thing from my board, it wouldn't necessarily be ask for this amount of money from these board members. It would be that you have the trust in me, that you are willing to open up your relationship world, that I will thoughtfully and strategically approach that relationship with that person. That's a big ask, right? For a board member to have their own personal and professional contacts and to trust the ED to the point where they're willing to share that person with the executive director is the biggest thing ever. I mean, the math is simple. If I had 10 contacts in my relationship world and every board member of my 10 also had 10 contacts, the difference between me having 10 people in my relationship world to having 100 people in my relationship world. And so that is the biggest thing. It always, I think, is the biggest thing. But again, now in a thoughtful manner, it's even that much more important. And I think sometimes, even though it might seem intuitive from an executive director standpoint, it needs to be emphasized to the board members of how important that really is. It doesn't necessarily mean we're asking for a gift. I'm just asking for board members that wherever they're at, in their office, at a gala, at a work event, that they have my nonprofit in mind. And when they think of somebody who could be interested in our mission or be helpful in what we're trying to do, that they feel comfortable with creating an email and saying, Jeff, meet John, John, meet Jeff. I'm on the board of this organization, and I think there's some areas that might be of interest to you to get involved with. And then hand that off to me. It doesn't necessarily mean that the board member's not asking for gifts. It could be that they ask that in tandem with the ED. It could be they ask by themselves, or they're just willing to hand off the relationships. So I just think that's an important thing to emphasize, really, pandemic or no pandemic. And then on the board fundraising roles, this is actually a slide that we had before COVID even hit us. And again, these are basic areas of the roles that board members play, right? They contribute, right? They have their give, get, and give their own personal gift to the organization. They solicit their own friends and colleagues, getting back to the relationship world, to get involved with the organization. They're always having an eye out to look to recruit new board members, and they continue to strengthen the board. And then they have the overseeing function, which is the governance function. So that doesn't change. I think under COVID, how it does get a little nuanced is, as far as contributions and personal contributions, now is the time to do that. If I'm a board member and I always give my gift on December 31st, I think this year I'm probably going to give it now, right? Because the stress that the EDs and organizations are under to make sure they reach their financial and revenue goal and finish in the black is extreme right now. And to have that money and know that it's there is really important. And it can be, if you haven't given your personal gift already, to do so. On the solicitation side, again, it's not necessarily about asking for gifts. It is willing to create and begin conversations and connections to really work with the DED to help steward the gifts. You know, one of the steps in the process of the stewarding gifts that are currently in play is which one of those gifts is associated to certain board members, and working in conjunction with that board member and the ED to figure out what's the right steps to renew that gift. Certainly, if a gift was given on March 1st, I have until next March to steward that gift. But if that gift is coming due on June 1st or July 1st, you know, what is the approach that we as a board member and executive director are going to take? On the recruitment side of board members, most nonprofits should have a board development matrix, which is basically looking at the superpowers, but in a kind of a statistical format, which is looking at what are the skill sets we currently have on the board, which are the skills or diversity indices that do not currently exist. The question could be asked, are there areas in terms of skill set or background that we weren't necessarily looking for before COVID that now we actually need? So it's a question to ask about what you currently have and what you think you might need during this pandemic, and actually when the pandemic is behind us, fingers crossed. And then finally, on the governance side, you know, you come to the area of endowments and surpluses. Not all organizations or nonprofits have either, but for those that do, the surplus is oftentimes seen as a rainy day fund, and it's raining. But for those that don't, it could be a question, maybe not here and now, but something to think about. Could this lend to stability for our organization as we move forward? Because there is a lot of uncertainty of what's going to happen with this pandemic as we start trying to open up the country again. And if you did have a surplus in place, would it make sense? I spoke to an ED who initially, this is prior to COVID, had said he didn't really want to look for a surplus. He wanted to put the money towards the programming. And now his perspective has changed on that a bit. If you have the opportunity to build a surplus, or if you do currently have an endowment, are there opportunities to try to restructure that endowment if you do happen to be in a financial precarious situation right now? Okay. So I hope that wasn't too fast, but I wanted to make sure that I left ample time for our panel. I am going to share the second poll, which is, at this point in the year, is your nonprofit on track to meet its fiscal goal? Again, this is anonymous, so it's just statistical for the group to see. And while you're answering this, I will introduce our panel. So we have four folks that are joining our panel today. We have Daryl Bundridge, who's the Executive Director of City Year Philadelphia, who I've had the pleasure of working with for a number of years. And he is joined by his board chair, Arlen Green, the board chair of City Year Philadelphia. We have Christopher Morgan, who is Executive Director of Dance Place here in Washington, D.C., and he is joined by his board member, Adam Weirs, who's the treasurer of Dance Place and is involved with a great deal of the fundraising and fundraising strategy that takes place with the organization. So I want to give the opportunity for each individual to introduce themselves and the organization. So I'm going to start off with Daryl, and then we'll go to Arlen.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everybody. As Jeff said, I'm Daryl Bundridge. I'm the Executive Director of City Year Philadelphia. City Year is a national organization, a nonprofit AmeriCorps program. We are in 29 cities throughout the country, many of which are on today: Dallas, DC, Chicago, Philadelphia, and onward. We recruit 18 to 25-year-olds to do a year of service in urban communities in schools of need. So there are schools that are under-resourced, that due to systemic inequities, the children attending those schools and in those communities aren't receiving the supports that they need academically, social-emotionally, or otherwise. And our AmeriCorps members seek to help narrow or close that gap through the tutoring, through the mentoring, through the role modeling, and other partnerships that we provide with our students, our schools, teachers, and the community in general to help our students reach their potential.
Thank you, Daryl.
Sure.
Arlen?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having us today. I guess I'll just give you a thumbnail sketch of my background, how I got to City Year. I come from a banking family. I was in the banking business for a number of years, but then I went into the real estate world and I've run real estate funds, most recently just doing individual investing. I've been involved with nonprofits throughout my career, but I've never taken on the challenge of being a chair because I always noticed that it seemed like there was a lot of work involved and I had other things to do. Last year when things had slowed down for me a little bit professionally, I decided to go ahead and try this out. It turns out I was right. It does take a lot of time, but it's been a lot of fun and worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you. Christopher, Dance Place.
Aloha, y'all. My name is Christopher K. Morgan. I'm the Executive Artistic Director of Dance Place. My pronouns are he, his, him, and Dance Place is a 39-year-old art center that presents dance performances by DC area artists as well as national and international touring artists. In addition to that, we function also like a community arts center. So we have a wide range of programs that provide after school and weekend educational opportunities, often centered in dance, but really wide ranging for youth and adults. Some of our community programs really focus on our hyperlocal Edgewood and Brookland neighborhoods, where we've been located for about 35 of our 39-year history. And that's really trying to bridge some gaps in educational programs that have been detrimental to the growth of our youth and identifying some of those challenges and working with them with arts curriculum, but also life skills curriculum as well. It's a really interesting organization, and I've been its executive artistic director for just 3 years following founding leadership. So I think a lot of what I've been navigating is that transition, which was quite historic for the institution. And I came to executive leadership as an artist myself. So that's also part of the work that I've been doing.
Thank you, Christopher. Adam.
Hi, everybody. My name is Adam Weirs. Nice to see you and virtually meet you all. I am a board member with Dance Place, also the treasurer. Have been part of the organization for 6 years now. I met the founding and former executive director through a program here in DC called Leadership Greater Washington. That was a fantastic opportunity. I met Carla, joined the board a couple of years later, and was a part of bringing Christopher on board, which has been a fantastic transition. He's doing a really wonderful job. And I do not know where we would be if we did not have Christopher Morgan as our executive director, given all that's going on. So happy to be here, happy to chat. And thanks for the invite.
Thank you very much, Adam. So I'm going to kick it off. I want to remind you all while we're doing this panel, if you have any particular questions or comments, please put them in the chat and I will try to incorporate them as we have this conversation. The first one is the kind of the big kahuna, which is one, when is your fiscal year end, but what's the current financial health of your organization, and how has COVID-19 impacted your ability to raise money and reach your revenue goal? So why don't we start with you, Christopher?
Sure. Dance Place's fiscal year ends at the end of August. We have about a $2.2 million annual operating budget, which we've seen initially what I projected to be about a $435,000 loss in income. And that was a mix of earned income, our ticket sales and tuition, as well as some projections around decreases that we might expect to see in contributed income. We were very fortunate to receive a Paycheck Protection Program loan for about $168,000. So I think that takes that lost revenue to about 270 or so. But with that loss came some reductions in expenditures. So right now we're projecting that we're actually going to quite miraculously, and with a bit of hard work, it was a combination of sweat and miracle, projecting that we're going to end the year in the black. And what we're trying to do now is really think strategically. Of course, many of our grants do not neatly fit into our fiscal year and they overlap. So is there a way that we can push funding into our next fiscal year that helps us steady ourselves and strengthen ourselves in anticipation of what we anticipate will be further decreases in contributed revenue. And our earned income streams will also be greatly affected. Our building is likely to remain closed as part of the longest phases of reopening.
Thank you. Daryl?
Sure. So we have about a $10 million operating budget, which was whipping along quite nicely through February, and then COVID hit. And so since then, we've certainly suffered in terms of revenue loss and service projects that we provide, canceled events that would be fundraisers, and in those areas. Where we've been fortunate, though, is that some of the areas like our revenue through services to schools, public funding, in some spaces that had already come through, and other gifts have come through. And we've been also able to convert revenue that we were expecting in for some of those special events or those fundraising events into donations. So that's been helpful. That said, we're still potentially expecting to end the year somewhat in the red, potentially to the tune of $120,000 or so. But again, we're still, we have a fundraising campaign going on right now that may help address some of that challenge, and still some outstanding ask that may cut into that a little bit. But it's not so much FY20 that's our challenge. As we look ahead to FY21, that's where we've had to make some tough decisions about staffing and costs of that and things of that nature.
So this question is really for both the EDs and the board members on this, and which is, what is the role that your board plays in raising money for your organization? And particularly if you could talk about the relationship that you have with your board chair, your head of treasury and finance in going about that. So why don't we start off with Adam on this?
Sure. You know, one thought, I do think a part of the answer to the question is many of the things that you covered in your PowerPoint, sort of steady state, but an interesting thing maybe to point out is how that has changed and evolved in the last couple of months. Because it has, and I think there are some interesting and new things that I feel like are important roles for a board member in fundraising as a support. And I really like the way you put that in your presentation, Jeff, that being an extension of the executive director and staff is a really important thing. But I feel like right now it's really important for the board to help with awareness from a fundraising perspective, because I do see sources of fundraising and funding that are maybe non-traditional arising because of what's going on and all of the chaos and crazy. And, you know, a lot of them are popping up in areas and spaces where board members might see them first. And I think it's important for us to funnel those opportunities when we see them to EDs to make sure that they're aware. A good example of this was, you know, Facebook popped up a grant program really early on in the COVID stuff. And, you know, that the money goes fast. And there's a timeliness to this stuff right now that is really important for, you know, knowing what's out there, getting it to your executive director, making sure that they are on top of everything and know what to pursue or not pursue. And a lot of times it's not even useful or applicable, but I think it's important for us to just sort of funnel all this stuff to Christopher so that he can sort through it all and pursue the things that are worthwhile.
What Adam's saying is actually why I thought he would be a great person to invite rather than our board chair, who is also really wonderful. But throughout this particular time of the past 2 months, Adam literally forwards me every opportunity that he sees, or it seems that way anyway, and has just been a great kind of counsel on helping to sort through that. We have a wonderful staff, but it's great to have these other eyes out there. And yeah, made perfect sense for the subject of this conversation to me.
Fantastic. How about you, Arlen?
Yeah, well, being a funnel for opportunities, many of them Daryl's already aware of, but once in a while I sneak one in that he hasn't seen. I think at the end of the day, especially for us, we're an advisory board. Pretty much the main thing we bring to the table is fundraising. The staff, for any nonprofit, you never have enough staff, sometimes especially in the development area. So to the extent that we can serve as a way for the staff to leverage their activities, that's basically how we view our role.
Daryl, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, certainly getting the message out there and being ambassadors. I think we talk about that, you know, that whole adage of doers, donors, and door openers. I think we look to our board to be door openers. We were just having a nominating and governance committee conversation this morning, and we were talking about, you know, it's really important that right now, with people having so many different pieces of information putting in front of them right now to support, that the passion of our board members come through in terms of why are they connected, why are they committed to this organization and the work they do, and why should others connect in whatever way that is. And so I think leveraging that right now, back to the point that Adam was saying of reinforcing your presentation, Jeff, is the most, I think, important thing we could do is, you know, stewarding those relationships we have and talking about those and then inspiring others to do that talk to then convert into action.
I had mentioned from an external communication standpoint, you know, that we see this flurry of emails coming from the organizations about what's going on and trying to create some urgency around it. And it can get a little bit lost in the noise because every nonprofit's doing it. Has your external communications changed in any way during this crisis? And if so, how? We can start with you, Christopher.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think we're doing less kind of broad e-blasts that have any kind of ask attached to them, and a lot more personal, direct contact with funders and donors. The stewarding of relationships that you referred to in your PowerPoint, I think really are at the core of that. 3 years into my tenure here, I was gratefully just far enough along that I think I had established and started to develop my own relationships with all of those key folks. But then there's a a capacity issue, right? If we're trying to steward relationships with hundreds of folks, whether they be program officers at foundations, donors, and or board members who have sort of overlapping roles, right? Our board members, they are our funders too. It has stretched me and a couple of our staff members to a new capacity because it's not all just funneling through these e-blasts. And because of our relative financial healthiness at this moment in time, we've been circumspect about how much we're asking the broader public because of that inundation that you referenced. So it has shifted the focus a little bit and created some new capacity challenges.
Yeah, I have something I'd like to add to what I said before, and that is that, especially again for us, we get about a third of our budget from the federal government, a third from city and state and the school district, and a third from philanthropy. So the other significant aspect of board work for us is the government relations piece. And that has been particularly manifest through this last couple months. I've spent a lot of time, Daryl's spent endless hours working with trying to get to our legislators and our city councilmen, just trying to see if we're going to still be in the budget next year. So that's an important piece, and that has tripled in the last couple months.
I would just add that I think we have been practicing a little bit of a yes and approach to your point about the mass communication. I think that there has still been a need for people to hear that we are still operating. So because of the work we do with schools, people are wondering, well, what could you be doing? Schools are closed. Well, actually, the work we're doing with students right now in the virtual space is even more critical because they're trying to figure out what to do, and some of them are challenged in connecting. Some teachers are not comfortable in navigating the technological space, and so our young people are coming in and being the bridge between the two, and being creative in their outreach to students to get back online and engage in classes, and even being those voices to hear them talk through what they're experiencing. So being able to communicate to our various supporters, that's still going on. And will need to go on in a stronger way come next fall when we don't know what school is going to look like, is part of our key messaging to our larger groups, while our staff and our board members take those individual messages to those who support us in the corporate space, our family foundations, and our individual givers, as well as the public.
Communication. Okay. Staying on the communication topic for a moment, the first part of this question is directed to Daryl and Christopher, which is what is your interaction and communication interaction with both your larger board and, Daryl, you with Arlen, and Christopher, you with Adam, and has that changed and the relationship and the way you communicate with the board changed at all?
So I would say that Arlen and I communicated fairly frequently going into this. We had a standard biweekly meeting and felt pretty comfortable picking up the phone and calling or texting each other. That has certainly amped up over this time period. Our monthly communications to our board has become weekly. We've, normally have a quarterly board meeting. I think we've now had 2 to 3 additional ones since March as we've met about finances and budgets and things of that nature. So I think all of that has increased in terms of wanting to keep them aware, engaged, helping advise us, and keeping things moving forward.
This is our third time together today.
It is.
Jeff, when we had a prep call for this meeting, you had mentioned, vulnerability is a kind of strength. And I would say actually this time has highlighted for me something that I need to really strengthen, which is the volume and frequency of communication with all of my board. It has gone up during this time. I feel like with my chair and finance committee, of which Adam is the leader as the treasurer of our board, I have had pretty good communication. And I feel like I can call and text my board chair at any time. We have check-ins probably about every 2 weeks. That stayed similar The monthly updates, I had not been as regular on. It's transformed to weekly updates. Here's what's been happening in crisis management land. Here's the relief opportunities that have come forward. Here's the angel donors and the goodwill donations that have come in. Here's how our virtual programming has pivoted. So that communication feels like it's increased, but I think it's actually highlighted for me an area as an executive director that I really need to strengthen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I could add an additional perspective on this as well, I do think there can be a danger in this moment of actually too much communication in a way that could be burdensome for an executive director. And I think in some ways, I do think Christopher has been fantastic in the way that our communication for the whole board has increased, given crisis and all. I actually think there were some moments, probably like late March, where it was too much. And I think it was like we were overwhelming him because it was like all these emails and everybody wants to know what's this, what's that. And it's like, I do think a board needs to be thoughtful on some level about like, well, okay, but how much is reasonable and what should we expect in terms of communication? And let's make sure that it's not burdensome, because I think we should all, as board members, acknowledge executive directors' jobs right now are exceedingly difficult. And the crisis management part of this makes everyone really tired. It certainly makes me tired in my day job. And so like to add on top of that, a needy board that wants to know every single day what's going on, for good reason, it can actually be burdensome. So I think in some ways right now, the conversation should be give and take. And I think an ED should feel confident with their board to, push back a little bit in a respectful way and say, hey, I want to share and communicate, but like, let's not make this too much, because there's a lot going on right now.
Bethany Henderson, you may see this in the chat, asked for the panels, which I think you've touched on, which is how much communication is too much, and how much is your board relying on board leadership to dig into the daily, weekly strategy twists and turns versus involving the entire board. Any guidance on the optimal trigger to involve full board versus just board leadership in those daily, weekly twists and turns? Let's open it up.
So I have a suggestion, and it is one that, again, in a spirit of transparency, we are not doing well as a board right now, but I want us to get to, and we had a board meeting last night and started a conversation about it. And that is just filtering a little more the conversation amongst the board, and maybe having not everyone throw everything at Christopher, but we as a unit can be a little more cohesive and communicative. And then as we come up with ideas or things that we want to engage with Christopher and key staff on, we do that in a more organized way. I actually think that's a really healthy conversation for a board to have right now. Most boards are probably already talking about what can we do to help our ED and our organization in this time of difficult, craziness. One way to do that is to just communicate better amongst ourselves, to organize better amongst ourselves, and then to have, it doesn't have to be one point person, but maybe just a handful of people who are doing more of the touch points with ED and staff.
And another interesting comment, Roberto Efil, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, said, I think that the board chair should be responsible for protecting the EDs from the avalanche of communications from board members.
Jeff, if I could respond to that, I think, we were also thinking about and talking about this session in advance. Sometimes it's not about, I think that's a great point, but sometimes it's not about the board chair protecting, but sometimes it's about the board chair being, more of the messenger on behalf of the ED and on behalf of the staff, we appreciate that you all are supportive and we appreciate that you all care, but we also need some more action, we need less listening and more movement. And so I think sometimes, it's about that dialogue that the ED and the board chair have, and the ability to be transparent with each other in terms of saying, this is what I need. Arlen and I were sort of talking about being good cop versus bad cop in terms of how I message something to the board versus how he messages it, excuse me. to make sure that the necessary action comes through. And so I think there's
Gets to be the good cop. Daryl gets to be the good cop.
Well, I think that is a good point, though, right? And trying to decide who is the messenger, right? And I think that's a strategic decision. Sometimes it has more weight from the ED, sometimes has more weight from the board member or the board chair. One of the other questions here, and this is, I love this one because this is about the whole, if you guys have heard the phrase, board members should be chins in, paws out, right? So they're involved with helping with the fundraising and other areas of governance, but they shouldn't be involved in the operational day-to-day, dealing with staff issues, et cetera, et cetera. So the question from Holly Coons was, how healthy is it during a time of crisis to bring board members to what would otherwise be an operational decision, such as canceling income-producing summer campaigns?
I'd be interested in hearing Christopher's thoughts on that. I think that, when we're talking about programming direction and change, we have a programming board or a programming committee as part of the work we do. We call it our core support committee. And so while it would be interesting to get their advice or perspective on that, I think, that's something that should be sought from the staff of the board. I think that, the lines, just because we're in the crisis, in some ways need to be stronger as opposed to grayer, because that can add to the trauma and the tension of what everyone is already working through. So I think if staff are seeking that additional perspective or role, please offer it freely. But if not, then it's really helpful for the board to stay in that role of, okay, if this revenue goes away, how are we filling it? Or how are we making sure that image of the organization is still in good stead or what have you, but not getting into those nuts and bolts.
Yeah, that's very much in alignment with how I would approach this. Programming decisions are most well informed by the staff members who execute them and who are in direct contact with the communities that those programs serve. And while the board is often invested in them in many, many ways beyond financial, it's the staff that are really doing that work and know that community best. And so I would rely on them for those decisions. And the input is welcome, but I think one of the things that I find really healthy about our board is they understand that programming is not their role. They have opinions about it, they engage in it, and that seems clear and healthy. And I would agree, like, a time of crisis is not a time to flaunt those or to disregard those clear boundaries. It's a time to strengthen them. And sometimes that just involves a due diligence on that staff member or that ED's part to make sure the reasoning behind these decisions is thoroughly vetted and clear and can be communicated not just to the board, but to the broader community in a way that makes that feel like not a reputational risk.
I mentioned the whole notion of a superpower, right, with a board chair, board member, and what they are. I'd be curious to ask both Arlen and Daryl what they think Arlen's superpower is, and Christopher and Adam the same question for Adam.
Which of us do you want to go first, Jeff?
Why don't you go? Why doesn't Arlen first say what he thinks a superpower is, then you can respond.
Oh, it's like the newlywed game. Great. Let's do it.
For me, it's been clear. The biggest superpower Daryl has in my mind is his demeanor, in particular through the difficult times, and just capacity to handle the amount and the complexity of the things that come up. One of the things that I hope to provide is perspective as well, because for sure he's getting buried daily in all kinds of issues. I did remind him recently. I said, don't you remember fondly the good old days when all you had to worry about was asbestos in the schools? Now the whole system has been shocked. So it made those days look like nothing. At the time, asbestos was a big deal. Now it doesn't look so bad.
And what would you say your superpower is, Arlen?
My superpower?
Yeah.
I would say that I tend to have a strong ability to find a good story for almost any occasion. And as my grandfather used to say, if you don't see the occasion, you make the occasion to be able to tell the story. So.
Okay.
So I would definitely agree with Arlen about, I kind of couch it in a larger frame of he is a phenomenal storyteller, and with it is a great sense of humor. And I think he's able to leverage that by helping bring ease and comfort and relaxation to a group, and then be able to get into tough conversations or issues, or help bring the appropriate amount of levity to make a situation less tense, but while not running away from an issue. And I think that's a great source for a board chair to have, because they're often needing to lead on those challenging issues or conversations, whether it's individually or collectively. So I'm very appreciative of that.
Great. And Adam, what would you say yours is?
Me, Adam?
Yeah,
Do you want mine, or do you want what I think Christopher's is?
I want you. I want yours.
I don't know what my superpower is. I guess I know a thing or two about real estate, but that seems like a really weak superpower.
Well, it depends. Could be really powerful. What do you think it is, Christopher?
That's the obvious superpower that Adam possesses and has been very useful to our organization, both in our capital campaign, building renovation, and recent capital acquisition. But actually his real superpower is the calm, clear, voice that he brings to discussions and analysis of data. A board meeting can be full of 6 different opinions, and then suddenly Adam says, well, everyone, with this very measured, slow pace that actually gets everyone to calm down, sit and focus and pay attention and listen. It's
Okay.
incredible.
Let me round this out with one question from the group. It's from Melissa Novak. She said, on the fundraising front, what have other organizations done to motivate a board that is hesitant to make the ask to their personal networks, or especially in times of crisis?
I have something I could say about that, and that really goes to when I took on this role about a year ago. I told the people interviewing me, the other board members, that it was not necessarily my strength nor my interest to do fundraising, but I did recognize that that would be a part of the job. So I said I would try. I said I'd been on a lot of boards in the past and not been a particularly effective fundraiser over the years. Having said all that, it wasn't too long into this job that I was able to turn my attitude around by coming to a certain realization. And that was that in particular for philanthropically minded individuals and or foundations in particular who have to give money away, I'm really providing a service and solving a problem for them. Everybody who is in that category, who either wants to give money away or has to give money away, it's a problem. It's a good problem to have, but it's a problem. And I can solve that problem because I have a terrific answer to their problem. And just that twist in my own mind has taken away 95% of the discomfort I felt in doing the asks before I came to that realization.
Great. If no one else has anything burning, it's 3:05. I know we had scheduled till 3:30, but I don't want to keep you if I feel like we've covered a good amount of this. Any other questions that anyone has for the panel? If not, there's one last poll you can see there. If you're able to quickly answer that, that'll be helpful for us at the Sorkin Center as we continue to build out these calls and these Zoom calls and making sure we find relevant topics for the group.
Hey,
I
Jeff,
want
I'd
to,
respond to Susan's question there, just because I think I have a ready answer. Susan Stickley asked what has been the biggest change in each panelist organization's fundraising and development activities. I can be quick about this, sir.
yeah,
Um,
please.
the week before all of this started to impact us in Washington, D.C., we had just printed and packaged one of our annual giving campaigns, which is for some of our youth programs that have a really high scholarship percentage of folks that are high scholarship. And it was ready to go out in the mail, and then everything happened, and we realized that it might have come across as tone deaf to the quickly evolving financial and health crisis. So we did not send it out. We changed the entire campaign to digital. We postponed it, and we have completely altered the schedule with which we would normally approach this. We're still going through with it, but it's been paced very differently, and we're segmenting our mailing group in a totally different way. It's taken a lot more time and care and thought, but just given what's going on and how much need there is and how many asks we've cited several times throughout this conversation, the inundation that we're all experiencing. So we've had to really be focused about it. It has been paying off. We're actually seeing similar giving to what we had projected, but it's just coming in a slow and steady trickle rather than in a condensed, intense period. So hopefully, Susan, that's helpful. And yeah, the contact information, if for whatever reason my limited expertise is useful, I'd be happy to share after this.
And
Well,
Jeff,
yeah,
I'm
please.
sorry. This
Please,
is Daryl. If I could respond to Ned Reed's question.
Yes, please.
Our board does not have a history of supporting the organization financially. Any advice on how to nudge them in that direction? So when I stepped into the role as executive director 5 years ago, we had minimal board giving. There had been an expectation, but it quite frankly wasn't strongly reinforced. And we had to do a reset with our board. So I would say about 2 to 3 months after I came on board, we had a retreat. And I said that as part of taking over in this role, there were certain things that the board could count on me to do and give, but there were things that I needed of the board. And so resetting expectations of what the board needed to do, including being donors, because you can talk about an organization, but if people don't see that you're willing to put your money where your mouth is, then that sends a very different message. And so we had to then talk about what it meant for the donor give, what was realistic, how do we differentiate that based on our audiences and whatnot. But then we had to set that as an expectation, and our nominating governance committee had to reinforce that in our board commitment checklist, which we review annually. When people set up their goals, we then give reports to the nominating governance committee and to the board overall on where we are with attendance and event attendance and meeting attendance and our giving, so that that's out there, not by name, but by percentages. And then we follow up with people who are behind. So I think that setting that expectation, following it up with being willing to revisit it with people who are saying, well, I don't think I can do that, and giving them a way to gracefully bow out if they're not able to meet the new expectations of the board, and then go ahead with a reinforced notion of those expectations will help you make that pivot. Hopefully that's helpful to Ned.
It is. Thank you, Daryl.
Sure.
Thank you, Daryl. And thank you to Daryl, Arlen, Christopher, and Adam for this. I want to reiterate the powerful vulnerability for embracing that. I think it's good for everyone to hear that, some things you're doing great, other things you're struggling with. Like, I think everyone can empathize with that. But I do thank you for being part of this. And for the larger group, we will be sending a follow-up email. As I mentioned, we'll have the names of the people that participate in the organizations. If you want a connection, I'm happy to do it. Also, I'm a big user of LinkedIn. I always look for people on LinkedIn, so do that as well. But we'll be sending the recording from the meeting we had, any notes that would make sense, and then also the folks that participated. So we're hoping that this conversation can continue. In the meantime, if you have anything that you need or any questions or comments, feel free to reach out directly to me. I love the constructive feedback. The slide deck. Thank you, Bradley. We will be sharing the slide deck as well. So we'll be sending that along as well. So we just wish you the best. We are rooting for you. in this crisis. And please, if you have any new, unique ideas of how we can support the great and critical work you're doing, please let me know, because we really appreciate everything as leaders, as executive directors, as well as board members that you're doing for the communities that you serve in. So thank you again. And you all have a peaceful long weekend. It's Memorial Day weekend. Who knew? So enjoy it, and we look to see you again in our next session.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
so much.